Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Maludumim in Israel. We are all familiar with the idea of the one-track mind. This is something we all perhaps experience in our own personal lives at one time or another, but also easily recognize in the minds of others. The one-track mind is that which only works in one particular mode of operation at a given moment. Such a state of mind finds it difficult or even impossible to switch out of that mode into some other way of thinking. There doesn't seem to be any great reason for this experience. It is simply one of the ways in which the mind works, for better or worse. The one-track mind experience can be due to the emotional state in which the mind finds itself. In other words, due to whatever emotional feelings are pulling it or dominating it in a certain situation, it is unable to extricate itself from those emotions and remains under their sway as long as they maintain control. But it could also be due to some non-emotional process going on through the mind. It could be that the person is thinking in a certain direction and they have no desire or will to think in any other way. This is extremely common, and we all go through it at various times of our lives. When we see it in another person, we may be startled or annoyed that they are unable to break out of this one-track way of thinking. But we would be wise to remember at such times that we ourselves are just as likely to fall prey to this experience. It is who we are. Why does the mind do this? Why can't it switch modes to its heart's content whenever the situation calls for it to do so? The answers to this question are as complex as the mind itself. There may be some chemical basis for this form of mental inertia, but it could just as well be a purely psychic phenomenon, which may only be peripherally related to chemicals in the brain. It could even be called spiritual for those who prefer to see things in that manner. The bottom line is that for some reason, our minds sometimes function like one of those shopping carts that always wants to go in one direction, no matter which way we push it. This method of thought tends to be seen as an obstacle to clear thinking. It is usually an insult for one person to accuse another of having a one-track mind, but occasionally works out in our favor. Being single-minded about something allows us to accomplish a task that we might have given up on otherwise. It serves as a kind of built-in boost to the will, which enables focus and perseverance. Thus, it is a bit of a blessing and a curse, working in our favor at times and working against us at others. One of the more interesting aspects of the mind is when it is challenged to operate on two completely different modes at the same time. Those with a tendency towards one-tracking have more difficulty maintaining this mental situation. They may not be able to think straight when caught up in an emotional turmoil. They may not be as apt to sense emotion when engaged in deep thought. But there are others who are experts at this, switching from one to the other with the blink of an eye. This may seem almost miraculous to those who cannot master it, or it may seem to be a sign of instability or an inability to stay on the subject at hand. One of those modes is of a purely spiritual nature. Things get even more complicated. Spiritual modes of the mind don't fit as readily into the familiar categories we place mental experiences. They are not really thoughts in the usual proactive sense, nor are they really emotions. They seem to be more in line with the nebulous category of the imagination. But even there, they are not an exact fit. A spiritual state of mind is one in which the mind appears to be outside of itself, in some sort of infinite space in which the normal restrictions no longer apply. How does one merge this state with the normal modes of thought and emotion? Is there any way to multi-track things so that both could be experienced simultaneously? This week's Parsha is called Vayeira, a word that is both simple and highly complex. It means, and he appeared, but it is used in relation to Hashem appearing to Abraham seemingly out of the blue. This appearance comes right after the end of last week's Parsha, in which Abraham received the commandment of circumcision and actually did it on himself, his son Yishmael, and the male members of his household. The Epiphanos experience, which introduces this week's Parsha, seems to have nothing to do with circumcision. It happens with no prior warning. The Parsha begins, quote, Hashem appeared to Abraham in the plains of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. As if that wasn't strange enough, the very next verse ignores this amazing statement and goes into a completely different subject that seems to have nothing whatsoever to do with Hashem appearing to Abraham. It involves three guests who emerge out of nowhere and are standing right near him. He runs to greet them and invites them in for a meal. There are hectic preparations, which involve him insisting that they stay and telling his wife, Sarah, to bake cakes. He goes through the enormous effort of preparing a calf to eat, presumably going all the way from slaughtering it to putting it out on the table to eat. In the midst of all this, the men ask him where his wife is. He responds that she is in the tent. One of them pulls the biggest surprise of this whole unlikely series of events and tells him that Sarah, who up to that had been barren, would bear a son within about a year. Sarah laughs upon hearing this, regarding it as impossible owing to the fact that she had long passed menopause. Hashem, who has been apparently out of the picture this entire time, then asks Abraham why Sarah laughed. Hashem tells Abraham that nothing is impossible and that she will indeed bear a son in about a year. Sarah, somehow aware of this divine communication with Abraham, denies her laughter, but she is quickly reminded that she indeed laughed. At that point, the men get up to leave, heading in the direction of Sodom, where Abraham's nephew Lot had settled. This is the end of this relatively simple but highly provocative section of the Parsha. The rest of the Parsha deals with a wide variety of things. First, there is Hashem reappearing to Abraham immediately after the men leave and informing him of the plan to destroy the area of Sodom because of the great evil that had infected its inhabitants. The Torah goes to a somewhat lengthy back and forth bargaining session in which Abraham attempts to talk Hashem out of this act of destruction. At the end of all that, Abraham is satisfied with his efforts to spare those towns and returns to his previous situation. Next, those men, who are now described as angels, appear in Sodom and warn Lot about its imminent destruction. Lot is at first hesitant to accept this news, but ultimately is persuaded of the urgency to escape the destruction and flee for his wife. He manages to convince most of his family to leave with him, but only his two unmarried daughters survive long enough to find refuge with him in a cave in the mountains. As if to make this story even stranger, they manage to get their father drunk in the cave and engage in sex with him to become pregnant with his incestuous offspring. There's much more to the Parsha, but this is all we need for now. We shall focus on the fact that Hashem appeared to Abraham in the first verse, but then apparently vanishes for a while without telling him anything. Hashem does inform him of Sarah's laughter, but this seems like a side point to what is happening. The real point of Hashem's appearance seems to be to inform him of the destruction of Sodom and to evoke his reaction. In other words, this was all a prelude to the divine act of destroying Sodom and enabling Lot and his daughters to flee. But we have to wonder what was going through Abraham's mind this entire time. No less than Hashem, God, appeared to him out of nowhere and said nothing at all to him. Then he went through all that bother with those guests, preparing the meal and listening to their unlikely prediction. He has that strange dialogue of sorts with Sarah over her laughter, and then the guests leave. What was he thinking during all of this? There is no indication that Hashem's appearance had ended and that he was back down in the normal mode of thinking about preparing a meal. Hashem was still there in some sense that entire time. How was Abraham able to function on a mundane level when he was in the midst of this divine epiphany? This question is rarely asked by the many commentaries that deal with this story. There are so many other things to discuss that this question falls by the wayside. But it is a relevant question. How could a person be experiencing God on the one hand and preparing a meal on the other? How could he schmooze with his guests or even speak to his wife? Shouldn't he have told them all that he was in the midst of an intense spiritual encounter with God and that they would have to wait? When his communion with God picks up again after the guests leave, it seems that it hardly missed a beat. The dialogue, which had not happened when Hashem first appeared, finally takes place. Where was Abraham's mind before that dialogue? The easy answer to this question is that he was a classic one-tracker. He briefly experienced Hashem's appearance, but then immediately shut it off entirely when the ruckus with the guests took over. When that finished, he went back to his spiritual experience with Hashem. He was able to deal with both because he switched off one mode and focused on the other. This is how most of us would handle such a situation, assuming we could handle it at all. But this is a bit too simplistic. Perhaps there is another way of looking at things. Perhaps Abraham never switched off the appearance of Hashem. It wasn't dormant or on hold in some unexplained manner. It was there the entire time, always in Abraham's mind, even as he was dealing with more mundane things like meat, cake, and guests. He was communing with God as he was preparing a meal. As soon as the meal ended and the guests left, he went right back to communing with God. There was no need to one-track his mind. He could do both. This is the way we are made. We sometimes do have to zero in on one thing to the exclusion of all others. Some people are better at this than others, and some people cannot function any other way. But the mind is capable of amazing things, and one of them is to be spiritual and physical at the same time. This is by no means easy, but it is possible. The spiritual and the mundane do not always have to be at odds with one another. It is entirely within our capabilities to be in both states simultaneously. We can be aware of God as we eat or drink or schmooze or listen to music. It is simply a matter of opening the mind up to its vast potential. One of those potentials is awareness of God, which we can maintain while washing the dishes. Shabbat Shalom.